Every man knows the weight of watching his family slip away, piece by piece. Jack Mallory had buried his wife 3 years ago, and now he was burying his pride, one unpaid bill at a time. The 58-year-old widower was fixing a leak in his old barn when his hammer broke through rotted wood. Below was a hidden room 20 feet underground. Inside were strange symbols and old artifacts that revealed a family secret dating back a century. His father had never told him about the resistance movement their family was part of during wartime. The discovery wouldn't make Jack rich, but it gave him something he'd lost when Sarah died, a sense of purpose. As he pieced together his family's hidden past, he began to understand his own future. But what would happen when his teenage daughter Sadie learned the truth about their family's buried history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after his discovery, Jack Mallory sat at his kitchen table staring at a stack of overdue bills, the weight of them heavier than the cast-iron skillet his wife Sarah used to make Sunday breakfast in. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to take another sip. Each envelope represented another piece of the life they'd built together, crumbling away. The mortgage, the utilities, Sadie's school expenses. At 58, Jack's hands still bore the permanent stains of motor oil and metal shavings from his 30 years as a mechanic. Those same hands had once been steady enough to rebuild a transmission blindfolded, but now they trembled slightly as he opened the foreclosure notice from First National Bank. 60 days. That's all the time he had left to come up with $12,000 or lose the farmhouse that had sheltered 3 generations of Mallorys. The house creaked around him like an old friend settling into a familiar chair. Built in 1887 by his great-grandfather Thomas Mallory, the 2-story farmhouse had weathered more storms than Jack cared to count. The wide plank floors bore the scuff marks of countless family dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. Sarah had loved those floors, spending hours on her hands and knees restoring them to their original luster during the early years of their marriage. "Dad, you're burning the eggs again." 17-year-old Sadie's voice cut through his reverie like a sharp blade through paper. She stood in the doorway, wearing the same defiant expression she'd perfected since her mother's death. Chin up, arms crossed, green eyes blazing with the kind of fire that reminded him painfully of Sarah. Her auburn hair, so much like her mother's, was pulled back in a messy ponytail that somehow managed to look both rebellious and beautiful. "Sorry, sweetheart." Jack rushed to the stove, scraping the blackened eggs onto a plate that had seen better days. "I was thinking about the bills." "I know." Sadie slumped into the chair across from him, her backpack hitting the floor, with a thud that seemed to echo through the house. "Mrs. Patterson says we might have to move." Eleanor Patterson, their closest neighbor, had been Sarah's best friend since childhood. She meant well, but her tendency to share information had always rubbed Jack the wrong way. Still, the woman had brought them more casseroles than he could count in the months after Sarah's funeral, and for that he owed her a debt of gratitude. "Mrs. Patterson talks too much," Jack said, setting the plate of salvageable eggs in front of his daughter. "We're going to figure this out." "How?" The question hung between them like smoke from a stubborn fire. "The garage closed 6 months ago. You haven't found steady work since. And don't tell me about that part-time job at Henderson's Auto, because we both know it barely covers groceries." Jack's jaw tightened. Sadie had inherited her mother's sharp mind along with her looks, and sometimes that combination cut deeper than he cared to admit. The truth was, he'd been avoiding this conversation for weeks, hoping something would change. Some miracle would present itself. But miracles seem to be in short supply these days. "I've been thinking about selling some of the land," he said. "Finally. The back 40 acres, maybe more. Mom loved that land." Sadie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She used to take me out there to pick wildflowers every spring. Remember how she'd weave them into crowns and pretend I was a princess? The memory hit Jack like a punch to the stomach. Sarah, laughing as she chased 5-year-old Sadie through the tall grass, both of them covered in pollen and pure joy. Those had been good days, before the cancer diagnosis turned their world upside down, before the medical bills started arriving like vultures circling carrion. "I remember," he said quietly, "but sometimes we have to make hard choices to protect what matters most. What matters most is keeping this place. It's all we have left of her." Sadie pushed away from the table, her eggs untouched, and shouldered her backpack. "I'm going to be late for school." Jack watched her go, the front door slamming with enough force to rattle the windows. He sat alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of better times and the reality of his current situation. The house felt too big and too small at the same time. Too big for just the two of them, too small to contain all the memories they'd made within its walls. After Sadie left, Jack found himself drawn back to the barn. In the harsh light of morning, the previous night's discovery seemed almost surreal, like something out of a dream or a book he'd read long ago. But the evidence was there. The broken floorboards, the dark opening that led down into the earth, the musty smell of decades-old secrets waiting to be uncovered. The barn itself was a testament to his family's history. His grandfather, William Mallory, had built it in the 1920s using timber from their own land and stone quarried from the creek bed that ran along the eastern border of the property. Jack's father, Robert, had added the hayloft in the 1950s, and Jack himself had installed the electrical wiring in the 1980s, back when he still believed the farm would provide a living for his family. The wooden ladder he'd improvised the night before still leaned against the opening. In daylight, he could see that the hidden chamber was larger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 12 feet square, with walls made of fitted stone and a vaulted ceiling that spoke of careful construction. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this space, and they'd done it well enough that it had remained hidden for decades. Jack climbed down into the chamber, his flashlight beam dancing across surfaces he'd barely glimpsed in the darkness. The symbols carved into the stone walls were more intricate than he'd realized, not random scratches, but deliberate markings that seemed to follow some kind of pattern. There were dates, too, etched into the stone. 1943, 1944, 1945. The war. Years. But it was the leather journal that drew his attention. Sitting on a stone shelf carved into the wall, it looked almost modern compared to its surroundings, the leather still supple despite the decades it had spent underground. Jack picked it up with reverent hands, feeling the weight of history in his palms. The first page bore an inscription in faded ink: "Property of William J. Mallory, Northern Star Brigade, 1943. His grandfather's name, his grandfather's handwriting. Jack had seen that careful script on old birthday cards and Christmas letters, but never in a context like this. As he flipped through the pages, fragments of entries caught his eye. 3 more tonight. Young lieutenant from Minnesota. 2 sergeants. From Ohio. Close call with Sheriff Morrison. Had to move them through the creek bed. Sarah says the locals are getting suspicious, but we can't stop now. Sarah. His grandfather had been married to a woman named Sarah, just like Jack's wife. The coincidence sent a chill down his spine, as if the past was reaching out to touch the present in ways he couldn't quite understand. The entries painted a picture of dangerous, clandestine work. His grandfather hadn't been just a farmer, as family legend had always maintained. He'd been part of something larger, something that required courage and sacrifice and the kind of quiet heroism that never made it into history books. Jack's father, Robert, had never spoken much about his own father. Robert Mallory had been a man of few words, content to work the land and tend to his family without dwelling on the past. He died when Jack was 25, taking whatever secrets he might have known to the grave. Jack had always assumed his father's silence stemmed from the natural reserve of a man who preferred action to words. Now he wondered if there had been deeper reasons. The sound of a car engine pulling into the driveway interrupted his thoughts. Jack climbed out of the chamber quickly, his heart racing as he tried to compose himself. Through the barn's open door, he could see Eleanor Patterson's ancient Ford pickup truck parked next to his own battered vehicle. "Jack Mallory, you look like you've seen a ghost," Eleanor called out as she approached the barn. At 73, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to respect her body's limitations, but her eyes were as sharp as they'd been when she was teaching 3rd grade at the local elementary school. "Just working on that leak," Jack said, gesturing vaguely toward the roof. "What brings you by, Eleanor?" Sadie looked upset when she got on the school bus this morning. "Figured I'd check on you both." She peered past him into the barn, her gaze lingering on the disturbed floorboards. "Looks like you found more than a leak." Eleanor had always been observant, a trait that had made her an excellent teacher and an occasionally inconvenient neighbor. Jack considered his options carefully. He could try to deflect her curiosity, but Eleanor Patterson was like a dog with a bone when something caught her interest. Better to give her just enough information to satisfy her without revealing the full scope of his discovery. "Found some old storage space under the floor," he said. "Nothing too exciting. Some family papers, that sort of thing." "Family papers?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "Your grandfather was always secretive about certain things. Sarah, your Sarah, used to joke that he probably had buried treasure down there somewhere." The mention of his wife's name in connection with his grandfather's secrets sent another chill through Jack. Sarah had been curious about family history, always asking questions about the older generations that Jack couldn't answer. If she were still alive, she would have been fascinated by this discovery. "Well, if there's treasure down there, I haven't found it yet," Jack said with forced lightness. "Just old papers and dust." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, and Jack had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his casual dismissal. But she didn't press the issue, instead shifting her attention to more practical matters. "I heard about the foreclosure notice," she said gently. "If there's anything Frank and I can do, we'll be fine," Jack interrupted, perhaps more sharply than he'd intended. "I'm working on some solutions. I know you are. You're a good man, Jack Mallory, and good men find a way." Eleanor's voice carried the kind of certainty that came from decades of watching people overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. "Your grandfather was the same way, quiet about his methods, but he always found a way to help folks when they needed it most." After Eleanor left, Jack found himself thinking about her words. His grandfather had been known for helping people, though Jack had never understood the full extent of that help. Neighbors would stop by the farm at odd hours, usually after dark, and leave before dawn. Robert had explained these visits as business related to crop sales or equipment sharing, but the explanation had never quite fit the pattern of secrecy surrounding them. The journal might hold answers to questions Jack hadn't even known he should ask. As the afternoon wore on and Sadie remained at school, he found himself drawn back to the underground chamber, flashlight in hand, ready to delve deeper into his family's hidden history. The story was beginning to emerge from the faded ink and careful handwriting, a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things during the darkest period of the 20th century. And somehow, Jack sensed that understanding this story might be the key to saving his family's future. That evening, after a dinner of leftover meatloaf and strained conversation, Jack spread his grandfather's journal across the kitchen table, under the warm glow of the overhead light. Sadie had retreated to her room to work on homework, leaving him alone with the whispers of the past. The entries were written in a careful hand, each word deliberate and measured. As Jack worked his way through the pages, a clearer picture began to emerge of his grandfather's activities during the war years. William Mallory hadn't just been helping neighbors. He'd been running an underground network that helped escaped prisoners of war make their way to safety. November 15th, 1943. Lieutenant Morrison arrived after midnight, half frozen and delirious with fever. Sarah says he won't make it another day without proper medical attention, but we can't risk bringing Doc Hanson into this. We'll have to rely on what we know and pray it's enough. December 3rd, 1943, close call today. Sheriff Morrison, no relation to the lieutenant, thank God, stopped by asking questions about unusual activity in the area. Told him we'd been having trouble with coyotes getting into the chicken coop, which explained the late-night disturbances. He seemed to buy it, but we'll need to be more careful. Jack paused at an entry dated December 20th, 1943. The compass arrived today along with new coordinates. The brigade is expanding operations into 3 states now. What we're doing here is part of something much larger than I ever imagined. The compass. Jack remembered glimpsing something metallic in the chamber the night before, but he'd been too overwhelmed by the journal to investigate further. Now, with the context provided by his grandfather's writings, he knew he had to go back down and search more thoroughly. The barn felt different in the darkness, charged with the weight of secrets that had waited decades to be uncovered. Jack's flashlight beam cut through the shadows as he descended into the hidden chamber, this time with a more systematic approach to his search. The compass was tucked into a crevice in the stone wall, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. When Jack unwrapped it, the silver surface gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday. The engraving was clear and precise. Northern Star Brigade, 1943, surrounded by coordinates that meant nothing to him without a map to reference. But as he turned the compass over in his hands, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The coordinates weren't random. They formed a pattern that suggested multiple locations spread across a wide geographic area. His grandfather hadn't been operating alone. He'd been part of an organized network with sites scattered across several states. "Dad, what are you doing out there?" Sadie's voice from the barn entrance startled Jack so badly that he nearly dropped the compass. He quickly pocketed it and climbed out of the chamber, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't sound completely insane. "Just checking on." "And that leak again," he said, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "Storm's supposed to hit tomorrow." Sadie stood silhouetted in the doorway, wearing the oversized flannel shirt that had been her mother's favorite. In the dim light, with her hair loose around her shoulders, she looked so much like Sarah that Jack's throat tightened with familiar grief. "You've been out here for 2 hours, she said. "I finished my homework and came looking for you." 2 hours? Jack checked his watch and realized she was right. He'd been so absorbed in the journal and the discovery of the compass that time had slipped away from him entirely. "Dad, what's really going on? And don't tell me it's about a roof leak, because I saw you put something in your pocket just now." Jack looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just Sarah's features, but also her determination and intelligence. Sadie was 17 years old, practically an adult, and she deserved better than evasions and half-truths. But how could he explain something he barely understood himself? "Come inside," he said finally. "I'll show you what I found." Back in the kitchen, Jack spread the journal open to one of the more detailed entries and placed the compass beside it. Sadie's eyes widened as she read her great-grandfather's words, her fingers tracing the faded ink as if she could absorb the history through touch. "He was helping prisoners escape," she whispered. "Great-grandpa was part of some kind of resistance." "It looks that way. I'm still trying to piece it all together, but your great-grandfather was apparently involved in helping Allied prisoners of war who had escaped from German camps. They called themselves the Northern Star Brigade." Sadie picked up the compass, turning it over in her hands the way Jack had done earlier. "These coordinates, do you know what they point to?" "Not yet, but I'm thinking about finding out." "We should research this," Sadie said, her earlier sullenness replaced by genuine excitement. "We could look up historical records, maybe find out more about this Northern Star Brigade. There might be other families who know about this." Jack felt a flutter of hope at the word "we." It had been months since Sadie had shown enthusiasm for anything they might do together. But then reality crashed back down on him like a wave against rocks. "Research takes time and money we don't have," he said. I need to focus on finding work, not chasing ghosts from 70 years ago. The light in Sadie's eyes dimmed immediately. Right, because the past doesn't matter. Only the bills matter. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. She pushed back from the table, the compass still in her hand. Mum would have wanted to know about this. She would have thought it was important. The mention of Sarah hit Jack like a physical blow. His wife had been fascinated by family history, always encouraging him to ask his father more questions about the older generations. She'd been the one to carefully preserve old photographs and letters, creating albums that told the story of their family's journey from Ireland to America in the 1850s. "Your mother isn't here," Jack said quietly, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. Sadie's face crumpled as if he'd slapped her. "No, she's not, and neither are you, not really. You're so busy feeling sorry for yourself that you can't see anything else." She set the compass down on the table with exaggerated care and walked toward the stairs. "I'm going to bed, and maybe tomorrow you can decide whether you want to honor your family's legacy or just keep wallowing in self-pity." Jack sat alone in the kitchen after she left, staring at the compass and the journal and feeling like the worst father in the world. Sadie was right. He had been wallowing, so focused on their immediate problems that he couldn't see beyond them. But understanding his grandfather's story wouldn't pay the mortgage or put food on the table. Or would it? As he read through more entries, a pattern began to emerge. The locations mentioned in his grandfather's writings weren't random hiding spots. They were carefully chosen safe houses, each one providing strategic value in moving people across the country. The Northern Star Brigade had been more than just a local operation. It had been a sophisticated network with resources and connections that spanned multiple states. Jack pulled out his laptop, its screen flickering to life in the darkened kitchen. If the Northern Star Brigade had been a real organization, there might be historical records, maybe even recognition of their work. And if the sites mentioned in his grandfather's journal were historically significant, the search results that came up made Jack's pulse race. The Northern Star Brigade wasn't just a footnote in history. It was a well-documented organization that had successfully helped hundreds of escaped prisoners of war reach safety during World War II. Articles from historical societies, references in academic papers, even a mention in a book about civilian resistance efforts during wartime. But it was the last search result that made Jack's hands tremble as he clicked on the link. The headline read, "Historic Preservation Grants Available for Documented Underground Railroad and Resistance Sites." The article explained that properties with documented historical significance related to resistance movements could qualify for substantial grants to preserve and maintain their historical integrity. The grants weren't just for covering preservation costs. They could also provide ongoing funding for educational programs and site maintenance. Jack's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. If he could prove that his family's farm had been part of the Northern Star Brigade network, if he could document its historical significance, there might be a way to save the property and honor his grandfather's legacy at the same time. The compass. Coordinates suddenly took on new meaning. They weren't just historical curiosities. They were potentially the key to proving his grandfather's involvement in the resistance movement. Each location represented evidence, documentation that could support his claim for historical recognition. But first, he would need to follow those coordinates and see what he could find. And despite their argument, despite the tension between them, he knew that Sadie was right about one thing. This was something they should do together. The past and the present were about to collide in ways Jack couldn't yet imagine, and the journey would test everything he thought he knew about his family, himself, and what it meant to carry on a legacy worth preserving. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. Jack found Sadie at the kitchen table, already dressed for school, studying the compass with the focused intensity she usually reserved for her advanced mathematics homework. "The first set of coordinates," she said without looking up. "There, only about 40 miles north of here. I looked them up online." Jack poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made, stronger than he liked it, but he didn't have the heart to complain. The gesture felt like an olive branch, and he wasn't about to reject it over something as trivial as coffee strength. "Sadie, about last night." "You were right," she interrupted. "We can't eat family history, but we can't live without it either. Mom taught me that." The mention of Sarah stung, but it was the kind of pain that reminded Jack of something precious rather than something lost. His wife had always believed that understanding where you came from was essential to knowing where you were going. "I've been thinking," Jack said carefully, "maybe we could take a drive this weekend. See what's at those coordinates. If nothing else, it might help us understand your great-grandfather better." Sadie's face brightened, but she tried to hide her enthusiasm behind a mask of teenage nonchalance. "I suppose I could clear my schedule. Your schedule of sleeping until noon and complaining about being bored. I'll have you know that complaining about being bored is very time-consuming work." She finally smiled, and Jack felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for months. After Sadie left for school, Jack found himself at loose ends. He'd called in sick to his part-time job at Henderson's Auto. Not entirely a lie, since the thought of changing oil and rotating tires while his mind churned with questions about his grandfather made him feel genuinely nauseated. Instead, he decided to make the drive to the coordinates alone as a scouting mission for the weekend trip with Sadie. The address led him through rolling farmland that looked much like his own property, past weathered barns and farmhouses that had seen better decades. When his GPS announced that he'd arrived at his destination, Jack found himself staring at an abandoned 2-story farmhouse with broken windows and a sagging front porch. The property clearly hadn't been occupied in years. Weeds grew tall around. The foundation and several roof shingles had blown away, leaving dark patches that suggested water damage. But there was something about the structure that reminded Jack of his own home. The same federal-style architecture, the same attention to detail in the stonework around the foundation. Jack parked his truck and approached the house cautiously. The front door stood slightly ajar, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. He pushed it open carefully, half expecting the whole structure to collapse around him. The interior was a testament to decades of neglect. Wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, and the floorboards were warped and stained from years of roof leaks. But beneath the decay, Jack could see evidence of a home that had once been loved and carefully maintained. It was in the cellar that he found what he was looking for. The basement stairs creaked ominously under his weight, but they held. At the bottom, Jack's flashlight beam revealed a space that had been carved out of the bedrock, similar to the chamber under his own barn, but larger and more elaborate. And there, tacked to one of the stone walls, was a hand-drawn map. The map was remarkably detailed, showing not just the local area, but a network of roads, safe houses, and what appeared to be escape routes stretching across 3 states. Locations were marked with symbols that matched some of the markings Jack had seen in his grandfather's journal. At the bottom of the map, in the same careful handwriting he'd come to recognize, were the words Northern Star Brigade, Network Operations 1943-1945. Jack studied the map for nearly an hour, taking photographs with his phone and trying to memorize the details. The scope of the operation was breathtaking. His grandfather hadn't just been helping a few escaped prisoners, he'd been part of a sophisticated network that had moved hundreds of people across enemy territory. But it was the personal touches that made the discovery truly meaningful. In one corner of the cellar, someone had carved initials into the stone. WM plus SM, 1944. William Mallory and Sarah Mallory, his grandparents, had been here together, working side by side in dangerous circumstances, risking everything for people they'd never met. On the drive home, Jack's mind raced with possibilities. The map represented documentation of historical significance that could support his application for preservation grants. But more than that, it represented a legacy of courage and compassion that he was only beginning to understand. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost missed the sheriff's car parked in his driveway. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood on Jack's front porch, his broad frame blocking most of the doorway. At 55, Bradley had been keeping the peace in their rural county for nearly 2 decades, and he had the kind of steady, no-nonsense demeanor that inspired confidence in law-abiding citizens and worry in everyone else. "Afternoon, Jack," Bradley said, touching the brim of his hat. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by. Had a few questions about some unusual activity in your area." Jack's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of unusual activity?" "Eleanor Patterson mentioned you'd been doing some excavation work in your barn, said you found some old family papers. Thing is, we've had reports of people poking around abandoned properties lately, looking for anything valuable they can haul away. Wanted to make sure you hadn't run into any unwelcome visitors." The relief Jack felt was almost overwhelming. Bradley wasn't here because he knew about the chamber or the artifacts. He was just doing his job, checking on a neighbor who might have encountered thieves or vandals. "Haven't seen anyone who doesn't belong," Jack said honestly. "Just found some old storage space under the barn floor. Family history stuff, like Eleanor said." "Good to hear. Mind if I ask what kind of family history?" Jack hesitated for a moment, then decided that a carefully edited version of the truth was better than an outright lie. "Papers from my grandfather's time. Looks like he was more involved in community activities during the war than I'd realized." Bradley nodded, apparently satisfied. "Your grandfather was a good man. Helped a lot of folks over the years from what I've heard. Well, if you do see anything suspicious, give me a call. And Jack, yes, I heard about the foreclosure notice. If there's anything the county can do to help, I appreciate that, Tom. Really. But we're working on some solutions." After the sheriff left, Jack sat in his truck for several minutes, trying to process the day's revelations. The map, the carved initials, the growing evidence that his family had been part of something extraordinary. It all felt overwhelming and hopeful and terrifying at the same time. When Sadie came home from school that afternoon, Jack was waiting for her with the photographs of the map spread across the kitchen table. Her eyes widened as she took in the details, tracing the route lines with her finger. "This is incredible," she breathed. "Look at all these locations. Great-grandpa wasn't just helping people escape, he was helping coordinate the entire operation." "There's more," Jack said, and told her about the carved initials, about the evidence that her great-grandparents had worked together in the resistance. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jack saw genuine joy in his daughter's eyes. Not the forced cheerfulness she sometimes put on for his benefit, but real happiness at discovering something meaningful about their family's past. "We have to visit more of these locations," she said. "We have to document everything we can find." Jack nodded, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. "We will, but Sadie, this has to stay between us for now, until we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." She agreed, and they spent the evening planning their next expedition, their heads bent together over the map and the compass, father and daughter united by a shared mission that neither of them fully understood yet, but both instinctively knew was important. The past was calling to them, and for the first time in years, Jack was ready to answer. The second set of coordinates led them to what had once been a prosperous dairy farm, now reduced to a collection of weathered buildings slowly surrendering to the advancing forest. Jack and Sadie arrived on Saturday morning, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a thermos of coffee that Sadie had insisted on bringing despite Jack's protests that she was too young for caffeine addiction. "Look at the barn," Sadie said, pointing. toward a massive structure that dwarfed even their own family barn. It's built into the hillside, just like the description in Great-Grandpa's journal. Jack consulted the hand-drawn map they'd found at the first location. According to his grandfather's notations, this site had been designated as Station 7, Processing and Documentation. Whatever that meant, Jack hoped they'd find more answers inside. The barn door stood open, hanging loose on ancient hinges that squeaked a protest in the morning breeze. Inside, shafts of sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny spirits. The space felt charged with history, as if the walls themselves remembered the secrets they'd once harbored. It was Sadie who found the hidden compartment. "Dad, come look at this." She was kneeling beside what appeared to be a solid wooden wall, but when Jack examined it more closely, he could see the faint outline of a panel that didn't quite match the surrounding boards. Together, they pried the panel away from the wall, revealing a cavity that had been carefully constructed to remain undetected. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, was a collection of documents that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. False identity papers. Dozens of them, each one meticulously crafted with different names, birthplaces, and biographical details. The work was professional quality, the kind of forgery that would have fooled all but the most careful inspection. And at the bottom of the pile, a handwritten note in his grandfather's familiar script. "Remember, every name represents a life saved, a family reunited, a future preserved." "Great-grandpa was a forger," Sadie said, her voice filled with wonder rather than judgment. "He wasn't just helping people escape, he was giving them new identities so they could start over." Jack studied one of the documents, noting the careful attention to detail in everything from the paper quality to the official-looking seals. This would have taken incredible skill and access to materials that weren't easy to come by during wartime. "Maybe that's why he was so quiet about his past," Sadie suggested. "Technical forgery was illegal, even if it was for a good cause. He was protecting himself and the family by keeping these secrets." The drive home was quiet, both of them lost in thought about the implications of their discovery. Jack found himself thinking about his own father, Robert, and the distance that had always existed between them. He'd interpreted his father's reserve as disinterest or disappointment, but now he wondered if it had been something else entirely. The weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared, knowledge that was both precious and dangerous. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table cataloguing their findings, Sadie's phone buzzed with a text message. Jack watched her expression change from curiosity to concern as she read it. "It's from my guidance counselor," she said. "She wants to meet with both of us Monday morning about my academic situation." Jack's stomach dropped. He'd been so focused on the mystery of his grandfather's past that he'd lost track of present-day responsibilities. "What academic situation?" Sadie's cheeks flushed pink. "I might have missed a few assignments lately, and maybe skipped study, or haul a couple times to research the Northern Star Brigade in the library." "Sadie, I know, but this is important, Dad. What we're discovering about our family, it matters. It's the first thing that's felt important since Mom died." Jack looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the teenager who'd been struggling with grief and anger, but the young woman who was trying to find meaning in a world that had taken away the person she loved most. The parallel to his own situation wasn't lost on him. "Your education matters too," he said gently. "Your mom would want you to graduate, to go to college, to have all the opportunities she dreamed of for you. Mom would want me to understand where I came from. She always said that knowing your history helps you make better choices about your future." The words stung because they were true. Sarah had been fascinated by genealogy and family stories, always encouraging Jack to ask more questions about his parents and grandparents. If she were still alive, she would have been as captivated by this discovery as Sadie was. "We'll figure out a balance," Jack promised. "But school has to come first. The past isn't going anywhere, but your senior year of high school only happens." "Unce?" Sadie nodded, but Jack could see the conflict in her eyes. She was torn between the excitement of uncovering family secrets and the mundane reality of homework and graduation requirements. He understood the feeling completely. He was facing a similar choice between exploring his grandfather's legacy and finding a way to keep their house from foreclosure. Monday morning's meeting with the guidance counselor was every bit as uncomfortable as Jack had expected. Mrs. Rodriguez was a kind woman who clearly cared about her students, but she painted a stark picture of Sadie's recent academic performance. "Sadie is a bright girl with a lot of potential," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "But her grades have been slipping for weeks now. She seems distracted, and several teachers have mentioned that she appears to be researching historical topics during class time rather than focusing on the lesson." Jack glanced at Sadie, who was studying her hands with intense concentration. "We've been dealing with some family issues," he said diplomatically. "I take full responsibility for not staying on top of her schoolwork. Mr. Mallory, I understand that you're facing financial difficulties, and I know how hard it must be to manage everything on your own. But Sadie is a senior. This is a critical time for her future. College applications, scholarships, graduation requirements, they all depend on her maintaining her academic standards." The word scholarships hit Jack like a physical blow. In all his worry about the foreclosure and his obsession with his grandfather's secrets, he'd lost sight of the bigger picture. Sadie's grades weren't just about high school graduation. They were about her chances of getting financial aid for college, her ability to build a life beyond the struggling farm. "What do we need to do to get her back on track?" Jack asked. Mrs. Rodriguez outlined a plan that involved make-up assignments, tutoring sessions, and a commitment from both Sadie and Jack to prioritize her education. It was reasonable and achievable, but it would require discipline and focus that Jack wasn't sure either of them possessed. That afternoon, as they drove home in silence, Jack wrestled with a decision that felt impossibly difficult. The investigation into his grandfather's past was giving him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, and it was bringing him closer to Sadie than they'd been since Sarah's death. But it was also a distraction from the immediate challenges they faced. The foreclosure, Sadie's education, the practical realities of their daily survival. "I'm sorry," Sadie said suddenly, "about school, about letting you down." "You haven't let me down," Jack replied automatically, then realized that wasn't entirely true. "But we both need to be smarter about how we handle this. Your mum would never forgive me if I let you throw away your future chasing ghosts." "They're not ghosts, Dad. They're family. And maybe understanding them is part of understanding our future." Jack didn't have an answer for that, but as they pulled into their driveway and saw the stack of bills waiting on the front porch, he knew that the past and the present were about to collide in ways that would test everything he thought he knew about being a father, a son, and a guardian of family legacy. The third location on their grandfather's map turned out to be the most revealing yet. Hidden beneath what remained of an old grain silo, Jack and Sadie discovered a cache of radio equipment that made Jack's hands tremble as he examined the components. The radio transmitter was sophisticated for its era, built with the kind of precision that spoke of expert knowledge and considerable investment. Vacuum tubes were carefully protected in custom-built housings, and the wiring showed the meticulous attention to detail that Jack recognized from his own mechanical work. But this wasn't the work of a simple farmer. This was the creation of someone who understood complex electrical systems. "Look at this," Sadie said, holding up a logbook that had been wrapped in waterproof material. "It's a transmission log. Great-grandpa was coordinating communications for the entire network." Jack studied the entries, each one precisely dated and timed. The log revealed a pattern of regular check-ins with locations across 3 states, coded messages about packages and deliveries, and detailed weather reports that had obviously been crucial for timing dangerous nighttime movements. He was the communications hub, Jack realized. All these different safe houses, all these escape routes, they were coordinated from our farm. The implications were staggering. Jack's grandfather hadn't just been a participant in the Northern Star Brigade. He'd been one of its key organizers, a technical specialist whose expertise had been essential to the operation's success. And he'd done it all while maintaining the facade of being a simple dairy farmer. But it was the personal touches that moved Jack the most. Tucked between the pages of the logbook were photographs, images of young men in military uniforms, some smiling for the camera, others bearing the haunted expressions of those who'd seen too much war. On the back of each photo, in his grandfather's careful handwriting, were notes. Lieutenant Davis made it to Canada, December 1943. Sergeant O'Brien reunited with family, Boston, January 1944. Each photograph represented a life saved, a family reunited, a future made possible by his grandfather's courage and ingenuity. Jack found himself staring at the faces, trying to imagine their stories, wondering what had become of them after they'd reached safety. "Dad, there's something else down here." Sadie's voice carried a note of excitement that had become familiar. Over the past few weeks, she was kneeling beside what appeared to be a stone foundation, but as Jack joined her, he could see that it was actually a carefully camouflaged entrance to another chamber. This space was smaller than the others they'd discovered, but it was clearly the most important. The walls were covered with maps, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be organizational charts showing the structure of the Northern Star Brigade. And at the center of it all, mounted on a wooden easel, was a detailed schematic of their own farm. Jack stared at the drawing, recognizing every building, every fence line, every detail of the property he'd grown up on. But the schematic showed things he'd never known existed: hidden passages between the barn and the house, underground storage areas, and what appeared to be an escape tunnel leading to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of their land. "Our farm was headquarters," Sadie whispered. "This whole operation was run from our property." The drive home was silent, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Jack's mind raced with questions about his father, about the secrets that had been kept for so many decades, about the weight of carrying knowledge that could never be shared. When they arrived home, they found Eleanor Patterson waiting on their front porch, her expression more serious than Jack had ever seen it. "Eleanor," Jack said carefully, "what brings you by? I think it's time we had a conversation about what you've really been finding in that barn," she said. "And before you try to give me another story about family papers, you should know that I was there the night your grandfather helped Lieutenant Morrison escape." Jack felt the world shift beneath his feet. Eleanor Patterson, his elderly neighbor, who brought them casseroles and worried about Sadie's grades, had been part of his grandfather's operation. "I was 19 years old," Eleanor continued, "and my father was the local doctor. We couldn't bring the wounded men to his office, so he treated them in our kitchen late at night while I kept watch. Your grandfather saved a lot of lives, Jack, and he did it with the help of people you've known your whole life." They sat in the kitchen, while Eleanor shared memories that painted a completely different picture of their small community during the war years. The local pharmacist had supplied medicines without asking questions. The woman who ran the general store had provided civilian clothes and supplies. Even the sheriff, Tom Bradley's predecessor, had been part of the conspiracy, deliberately scheduling his patrols to avoid certain areas on certain nights. "Your father knew," Eleanor said quietly. "Robert was just a boy then, maybe 12 or 13. But he was old enough to understand that what his father was doing was dangerous. He carried that burden his whole life, never knowing if it was safe to talk about it, never knowing who else might have been involved." Jack thought about his father's distant manner, his reluctance to share stories about the past. What he'd interpreted as emotional unavailability had actually been the careful silence of someone protecting secrets that could still harm people decades later. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jack asked. "Because you're in trouble, and you—" Need to know that your grandfather left you more than just a farm and some old artifacts. He left you a legacy that's worth preserving, and there are people who will help you preserve it if you know where to look. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, American Historical Preservation Society. She's been documenting resistance activities during World War II for the past 15 years. Your grandfather's story is exactly the kind of thing her organization exists to preserve and protect. That evening, after Eleanor had gone home and Sadie had retreated to her room to catch up on overdue assignments, Jack sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the business card. The foreclosure notice lay beside it, a reminder that time was running out on multiple fronts. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Jack felt like he had options. The discovery of his grandfather's role in the Northern Star Brigade wasn't just a family mystery, it was potential salvation. Historical preservation organizations had funding, resources, and the kind of connections that could make the difference between losing his home and securing his family's future. The past and the present were finally converging in ways that offered hope instead of just heartbreak. But Jack knew that taking the next step would require him to trust strangers with secrets that had been carefully guarded for 70 years. As he prepared for bed, Jack made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Tomorrow, he would call Dr. Hendricks and begin the process of bringing his grandfather's story into the light. The risks were real, but the alternative, losing everything they had left, was worse. The legacy of the Northern Star Brigade was about to emerge from the shadows, and Jack Mallory was finally ready to be its guardian. Dr. Patricia Hendricks arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt charged with possibility. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings. But it was her genuine enthusiasm for Jack's discoveries that convinced him he'd made the right choice in reaching out to the Historical Preservation Society. "Mr. Mallory, what you found here is extraordinary," she said, carefully examining the photographs Jack had taken of the radio equipment and organizational charts. "The Northern Star Brigade has been one of the most elusive resistance organizations. We've tried to document. Most of the participants took their secrets to the grave. They were standing in the underground chamber beneath the barn, and Jack watched Dr. Hendricks's professional composure give way to genuine excitement as she studied the carved symbols on the walls. Her assistant, a young man named David Chen, was documenting everything with professional photography equipment and careful measurements. "The construction alone is remarkable," David said, running his hands along the fitted stones. "This wasn't thrown together quickly. Someone invested serious time and resources in creating this space. Your grandfather was clearly one of the key figures in the organization," Dr. Hendricks added. "The technical sophistication of that radio equipment, the detailed maps, the coordination logs. This represents years of careful planning and execution." Sadie, who had been given permission to skip her afternoon classes for this meeting, peppered the historians with questions about the broader context of civilian resistance during World War II. Jack was grateful to see her channeling her enthusiasm into legitimate research rather than neglecting her schoolwork. "What happens now?" Jack asked as they climbed back up into the barn. "I mean, assuming you can verify everything we've found." Dr. Hendricks exchanged a meaningful look with her assistant. "That depends on what you want to happen. There are several options, each with different implications for your family and your property." They moved to the kitchen, where Eleanor Patterson was waiting with coffee and homemade cookies. Jack had invited her to join the meeting, partly out of gratitude for her guidance, and partly because her first-hand knowledge of the operation would be invaluable in verifying the historical record. "The first option," Dr. Hendricks began, "is simply documentation. We record everything you found, add it to our archives, and your grandfather's story becomes part of the official historical record. It's important work, but it doesn't come with any financial benefits." Jack's heart sank slightly, but he tried not to let his disappointment show. The second option, she continued, is to apply for National Historic Landmark designation. If successful, your property would be recognized as a site of national historical significance. That comes with federal protection from demolition or inappropriate development, and it can qualify for substantial preservation grants. How substantial? Jack asked, trying to keep his voice casual. For a site of this significance, potentially enough to cover mortgage payments, restoration costs, and ongoing maintenance. The grants are designed to ensure that historically important properties can be preserved for future generations. Jack felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. What would that involve? David Chen consulted his tablet. A comprehensive historical survey, documentation of all artifacts and structures, verification of the historical narrative, and preparation of a detailed application to the National Park Service. It's a process that typically takes 6 to 8 months. 6 to 8 months? Jack's hope deflated like a punctured balloon. I have 60 days before the bank forecloses on this place. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but determined. That's where the third option comes in. Emergency Historical Preservation designation. It's rarely used, but in cases where a historically significant site faces imminent threat of destruction, we can fast-track the process. How fast? Sadie asked. With proper documentation and strong evidence of historical significance, we could have a preliminary designation within 30 days. That would provide immediate protection from foreclosure while the full application is processed. Jack looked around the kitchen that had been home to 3 generations of his family, imagining it filled with visitors who came to learn about his grandfather's courage. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. There's something else you should know, Eleanor said quietly. Something I haven't told you yet. Everyone turned to look at her, and Jack noticed that her hands were trembling slightly as she set down her coffee cup. Your grandfather didn't just help prisoners escape, she said. He also hid Jewish refugees who were trying to get to Canada. Families with children, people who had lost everything but were trying to start over in America. The room fell silent. Dr. Hendricks and David exchanged glances that suggested this information elevated the historical significance of the site considerably. There are photographs, Eleanor continued, hidden in my attic for 70 years. Pictures of some of the families your grandfather helped. Letters they sent after they reached safety. I've been waiting for the right time to share them. Why now? Jack asked gently, Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Because your grandfather made me promise that if the family ever needed help, if the farm was ever in danger, I should make sure people knew what happened here. He said the story was more important than the secrecy. That evening, after Dr. Hendricks and David had left with promises to expedite the historical survey, Jack found himself alone with Sadie in the kitchen. The business card for the emergency preservation application sat on the table between them, along with a stack of preliminary documents that needed to be completed. Are you scared? Sadie asked. Terrified, Jack admitted. Everything could change. People will want to visit, to learn about what happened here. Our quiet life, our privacy, it'll all be different. But we'll still be here, on the land, in the house, with the stories. Jack nodded, struck by his daughter's wisdom. She was right. The important things wouldn't change. If anything, they'd be more secure than they'd been in years. Your mother would have loved this, he said. She always believed that family stories were meant to be shared, not hidden away. She also would have been proud of you for figuring out how to save the farm by honoring great-grandpa's memory instead of running away from it. As they worked together, filling out forms and organizing documentation, Jack felt a sense of partnership with his daughter that had been missing since Sarah's death. They were no longer just struggling to survive. They were working toward something meaningful, something that connected them to the past while securing their future. The ghost of William. Mallory seemed to approve. his legacy finally emerging from decades of necessary silence into the light of recognition and preservation. The Northern Star Brigade would live again, not as a secret network of resistance fighters, but as a testament to the courage of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when history demanded it. And for the first time in years, Jack Mallory felt like he was worthy of carrying that legacy forward. 3 weeks into the emergency preservation process, Jack's world turned upside down in a way he never could have anticipated. It started with a phone call from David Chen, who had been conducting research at the county courthouse to verify property records and historical documentation. "Mr. Mallory," David's voice carried an excitement that Jack had come to associate with significant discoveries. "You need to see what I found in the deed records. Can you meet me at the courthouse this afternoon?" Jack arrived to find David surrounded by boxes of documents, his laptop open to what appeared to be a legal database. Dr. Hendricks was there as well, her usual professional composure replaced by an expression of barely contained amazement. "Jack," she said, "sit down. What we're about to tell you is going to change everything." David turned his laptop screen toward Jack, showing a legal document dated 1944. The heading read, "Deed of Trust and Historic Preservation Covenant, Mallory Family Farm." "I don't understand," Jack said, studying the document. "What is this?" "Your grandfather," Dr. Hendricks explained, "didn't just run a resistance operation from your farm. In 1944, he legally designated the property as a protected historical site under a federal program that was created specifically to preserve locations significant to wartime resistance activities." Jack's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. "You mean the farm has been protected all along?" "Not just protected," David said, pulling out another document. "Funded. Your grandfather established an endowment with the federal government to ensure the property's preservation. The fund has been collecting interest for 79 years. The numbers on the page seemed to swim before Jack's eyes. Principal amount, $50,000 in 1944 dollars. Current value with compound interest and federal matching funds, $2.3 million. "This can't be real," Jack whispered. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward. "It's completely real, and it's completely legal. The program your grandfather used was classified during the war and remained classified for decades afterward. That's why no one knew about it. The documentation was sealed in federal archives until 2010. "But why?" Jack asked. "Why would my grandfather do this and then never tell anyone?" "Because the program required absolute secrecy," David explained. "If the property's protected status had become public knowledge during the war, it would have compromised ongoing operations and put lives at risk. The families who participated were sworn to secrecy indefinitely." Jack thought about his father's lifetime of silence, the distance that had always existed between them. Robert Mallory had known. He'd carried this secret for decades, never able to share it, never able to explain why he seemed so worried about losing the farm. "There's more," Dr. Hendricks said gently. "The preservation covenant includes provisions for the family's financial security. Your grandfather wasn't just protecting the land, he was protecting your family's ability to stay on the land." She handed Jack another document, this one bearing official seals from the Department of the Treasury. It was a statement showing monthly payments that had been accumulating in an account established in his father's name and later transferred to Jack's name after Robert's death. "The payments have been going to an account you never knew existed," David said. "Your grandfather set it up so that the funds would only be released when the family demonstrated active stewardship of the historical site." Jack stared at the account. Statement: monthly payments of $1,847 had been deposited for 79 years. The current balance was $347,000 and growing. "How do I access this money?" he asked, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. "That's the beauty of your grandfather's planning," Dr. Hendricks said. "By applying for historical preservation status and actively working to document and preserve The site, you've met all the conditions outlined in the original covenant. The funds are yours to use for property maintenance, mortgage payments, and educational programs related to the site's historical significance. Jack felt the weight of decades of financial struggle lifting from his shoulders. Not only could he save the farm, he could restore it, improve it, and turn it into the kind of memorial his grandfather had envisioned. But it was the final document that brought tears to his eyes. This is a letter your grandfather wrote to be opened when the preservation fund was activated, Dr. Hendricks said softly. It's addressed to his family. The letter was in his grandfather's familiar handwriting, the same careful script Jack had come to know from the journal entries. To my son, my grandson, and the generations yet to come. If you are reading this, it means that our family's secret has finally been revealed, and our work has been deemed worthy of remembrance. I pray that this moment brings you not burden, but blessing. The money I have set aside is not payment for what we did during the war. No amount of money could repay the debt we owe to those who sacrificed everything for freedom. This fund is my investment in our family's future, my way of ensuring that the land that sheltered heroes will continue to shelter our children and their children. I have kept these secrets not out of shame, but out of necessity. The work we did was dangerous, and the consequences of discovery would have extended far beyond our family. But I always hoped that someday, when it was safe, when the world was ready, our story could be told. Use this gift wisely. Honor the memory of those we helped, but do not let the past become a burden. The farm is meant to be a living memorial, a place where families grow and thrive, where children learn that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Your great-grandmother Sarah and I built something here that was bigger than ourselves. Now it falls to you to decide what comes next. I trust you to choose well. With all my love and faith in your judgment, William James Mallory, Northern Star Brigade, 1944. Jack's hands shook as he finished reading. The letter was more than just explanation. It was absolution. His grandfather hadn't abandoned them to struggle with an impossible financial burden. He'd provided for them in the most thoughtful way possible, ensuring that the solution would only come when they were ready to embrace their family's legacy. That evening, Jack sat in his kitchen with Sadie, the documents spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle that had finally been solved. The foreclosure notice lay beside them, rendered meaningless by the stroke of a pen signed 79 years ago. "We're going to be okay," Sadie said, her voice filled with wonder. "More than okay. We're going to be able to do everything Great-Grandpa dreamed of." Jack nodded, still struggling to process the magnitude of what had changed in a single afternoon. "Your mother would have been amazed by this. She always said your great-grandfather was a man who thought ahead. But I don't think even she imagined anything like this." "What do we do now?" Sadie asked. Jack looked around the kitchen that would remain theirs, in the house that would never again face foreclosure, on the land that had been protected all along by a grandfather whose wisdom had spanned decades. "Now we figure out how to be worthy of the trust he placed in us," Jack said. "We learn everything we can about what happened here, we preserve it properly, and we share it with the world in a way that honors everyone who risked their lives for freedom." The transformation was complete, but it was only the beginning. The Mallory farm was about to become something unprecedented, a living memorial to civilian resistance, a testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and most importantly, a secure home where a father and daughter could build a future worthy of their remarkable past. The Northern Star Brigade's greatest victory wasn't the hundreds of lives they'd saved during the war. It was the family they'd protected long after. The fighting was over. The weeks that followed the revelation of his grandfather's endowment passed in a blur of activity that felt both overwhelming and energizing. Jack found himself at the center of a whirlwind of historians, preservation specialists, and media attention that he never could have imagined when he first fell through those rotted barn boards. The financial pressure that had dominated his life for years was gone, replaced by the challenging but rewarding work of transforming the farm into a proper historical site. The first payment from the Preservation Fund had arrived within days of the paperwork being filed, enough to pay off the mortgage and fund the initial restoration work. But it was the human stories that began to emerge that truly brought home the significance of what his grandfather had accomplished. Dr. Hendricks had put out a call through historical societies and veterans organizations, asking for anyone with connections to the Northern Star Brigade to come forward. The response had been overwhelming. Letters arrived daily from families whose grandfathers or great-uncles had been helped by William Mallory's network. Some included photographs, others contained detailed accounts of escape routes and safe house experiences. The most moving response came from a woman named Margaret Morrison, whose grandfather had been Lieutenant Morrison, the young officer mentioned in William Mallory's journal entries. She drove from Minneapolis to meet Jack and Sadie, bringing with her a collection of letters her grandfather had written to his family during and after his escape. "Your great-grandfather saved my grandfather's life," she told them, sitting in the same kitchen where Lieutenant Morrison had been nursed back to health in 1943. Grandpa never forgot the kindness he received here. He used to say that the Mallory farm was where he learned that ordinary people could be angels when the world needed them most. Margaret had brought photographs of her grandfather's post-war life, his wedding, his children, his successful career as a teacher in Minnesota. "None of this would have existed without your family," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather had 6 children and 14 grandchildren. We're all here because of what happened in this house." Similar stories emerged from other families. The radio operator mentioned in the transmission logs had gone on to become a small-town mayor in Ohio. One of the Jewish refugees, helped by the network, had founded a successful business in Toronto and used his wealth to help other displaced families immigrate to North America. The ripple effects of William Mallory's courage had spread across generations and continents. As the date approached for the official National Historic Landmark designation ceremony, Jack found himself facing a decision he'd never anticipated. The federal preservation program required that the site be open to the public for educational purposes, but the specifics of how that would work were largely up to him. "We could set up a simple museum in the barn," suggested David Chen, who had become the project coordinator. "Display the artifacts you found, tell the story of the Northern Star Brigade, maybe have guided tours a few days a week." But Sadie had bigger ideas. "What if we created a real educational center," she proposed during one of their planning meetings. "Not just about great-grandpa's network, but about civilian resistance movements throughout history. We could have visiting scholars, research programs, maybe even partner with schools to create curriculum about ordinary heroes." Jack looked at his daughter with pride and amazement. The sullen teenager who had been struggling with grief and anger just months earlier had transformed into a passionate advocate for historical education. Her grades had improved dramatically as she threw herself into researching resistance movements, and she'd already been accepted to 3 universities with strong history programs. "That's a much more ambitious undertaking," Dr. Hendricks said. "Carefully, it would require significant funding, staffing, ongoing programming. The endowment can support it," Jack said, surprising himself with his confidence. "My grandfather set aside enough money to fund something substantial. I think he would approve of making this place a center for learning about courage and resistance." The planning process brought Jack and Sadie closer together than they'd been since Sarah's death. They spent evenings poring over architectural plans for the visitor center, debating the content of educational displays, and working together to catalog the growing collection of artifacts and documents related to the Northern Star Brigade. But it was the discovery of his grandfather's time capsule that provided the emotional climax Jack needed to fully embrace. His role as guardian of the family legacy, they found it exactly where William Mallory's final map indicated it would be, buried beneath the oak tree that stood at the corner of the property where the farm road met the county highway. The metal box had been carefully waterproofed and was in perfect condition, despite 7 decades underground. Inside was a letter addressed simply, "To my grandson's children." Jack's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Sadie standing beside him in the shade of the ancient oak. The letter was longer than the previous ones, written in the same careful script, but with a more personal tone. "My dear great-grandchildren, if you are reading this, it means that our family's story has finally been told, and you have chosen to carry it forward. I'm writing this letter on the day the war ended in Europe, May 8, 1945, as Sarah and I prepare for what we hope will be a return to normal life. But I have learned that there is no returning to the life we knew before. We have seen too much, done too much, risked too much to pretend that we can go back to being simple farmers. The work we did during the war changed us in ways that will echo through generations. I want you to understand that what we did was not heroic in the way that word is usually meant. We were not soldiers charging into battle or pilots flying dangerous missions. We were simply people who saw suffering and chose to help, who recognized injustice and decided to resist it, who understood that freedom is not a gift but a responsibility, that each generation must earn anew. The money I have provided is not meant to make your lives easier, though I hope it will. It is meant to give you the freedom to choose how you will serve the cause of human dignity in your own time. Every generation faces its own tests, its own opportunities to choose between comfort and courage. Your great-grandmother and I have been privileged to live through a time when the choice between good and evil was clear, when resistance was obviously necessary. You may face more subtle challenges, but they will be no less important. Use this farm as a reminder that ordinary places can be the sites of extraordinary acts. Use our story as proof that individual families can change the course of history when they choose to act on their principles rather than their fears. But most importantly, use the freedom we have helped to preserve to build lives of meaning, compassion, and service. The greatest memorial to those we helped is not a monument or a museum. It is a family that continues to choose love over hate, courage over fear, service over self-interest. I am proud to be your great-grandfather, even though I will never meet you. I trust you to carry our legacy forward in whatever form your generation requires. With boundless love and unshakable faith, William James Mallory. May 8, 1945. By the time Jack finished reading, both he and Sadie were crying. The letter was more than a message from the past. It was a commission for the future, a challenge to live up to the example set by previous generations while finding their own way to serve the cause of human dignity. He knew, Sadie said softly, he knew that someday his great-grandchildren would need guidance, and he tried to give it to us. Jack nodded, feeling the weight and privilege of carrying forward a legacy that was both deeply personal and universally significant. The work of preserving his grandfather's story wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about preparing future generations to recognize their own moments of moral choice and to choose correctly when those moments came. As they walked back toward the house, Jack realized that the restoration of the farm was more than a preservation project. It was a resurrection, of family pride, of shared purpose, of the understanding that every generation has the opportunity and responsibility to contribute something meaningful to the ongoing story of human freedom. The ceremony to officially designate the Mallory farm as a National Historic Landmark was scheduled for the following week. Dignitaries would come, speeches would be made, and media coverage would introduce the world to the story of the Northern Star Brigade. But the real ceremony had already taken place under an oak tree, where a grandfather's words had reached across 78 years to commission his descendants as guardians of a legacy that was both precious and perishable. Jack Mallory was ready to accept that commission, and he was no longer carrying it alone. The morning of the National Historic Landmark designation ceremony dawned with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Jack stood on his front porch, watching the steady stream of vehicles arriving for the event. Government officials, historians, descendants of Northern Star Brigade participants, and members of the media who had been drawn to the story of a hidden resistance network operating from a humble Midwest farm. But it was the sight of Sadie, dressed in her mother's best blue dress and carrying a wooden box she'd been preparing for weeks, that filled Jack with the deepest sense of accomplishment. His daughter had transformed from a grieving, angry teenager into a confident young woman who understood her place in a larger story of courage and service. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, joining him on the porch. "I don't think anyone can be ready for something like this," Jack replied honestly. 6 months ago, I was about to lose everything. Now we're about to become the caretakers of a national monument. "Great-grandpa would be proud," Sadie said, and Jack knew she was right. The ceremony took place in the underground chamber that had started it all. Dr. Hendricks had arranged for proper lighting and ventilation to accommodate the crowd. But the space still retained its mysterious, reverent atmosphere. The carved symbols on the walls seemed to glow in the artificial light, and Jack could feel the weight of history surrounding them. The Secretary of the Interior, a distinguished woman, in her 60s named Catherine Walsh, delivered the formal designation speech. She spoke eloquently about the importance of preserving sites that told the stories of civilian resistance, about the courage of ordinary Americans who had risked everything to help those in need. But it was when she invited Jack to speak that the ceremony took on its most meaningful dimension. "I never met my grandfather," Jack began, his voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber. "William Mallory died when I was just 3 years old, and my father rarely spoke about him. For most of my life, I thought he was simply a farmer who worked hard and minded his own business." He paused, looking around at the faces gathered in. The underground room, some familiar, others belonging to strangers who had been touched by his grandfather's work. "What I've learned over the past few months is that minding your own business sometimes means expanding your definition of what your business actually is. My grandfather understood that the welfare of escaped prisoners and refugee families was his business, even when it put his own family at risk." Jack's eyes found Sadie in the crowd, and she nodded encouragingly. "The artifacts we've found here tell a story of technical skill, careful planning, and coordinated resistance. But they also tell a story of ordinary people choosing to be extraordinary when history demanded it of them." He gestured toward the wooden box that Sadie held. "My daughter has prepared something that I think captures the spirit of what this place represents. Not just the history we're preserving, but the future we're building." Sadie stepped forward, her hands steady as she opened the box. Inside, nestled in careful padding, was a collection of items that represented the bridge between past and future. Her great-grandfather's compass, restored to working condition. Photographs of all the families they'd identified who had been helped by the Northern Star Brigade, and letters from current refugees and immigrants who had been inspired by the story to pursue their own journeys to freedom. "This compass pointed my great-grandfather toward people who needed help," Sadie said, her voice clear and confident. "Today, it points us toward our responsibility to continue that work in whatever form our generation requires." She lifted the compass from the box, its silver surface catching the light. The Northern Star Brigade didn't end when the war ended. It transformed. Every time someone chooses to help a neighbor in need, every time a family opens their door to a stranger seeking Safety, every time ordinary people decide that their comfort is less important than someone else's survival, the brigade continues. Jack felt his throat tighten with pride as he watched his daughter speak with the same passion and moral clarity that must have driven his grandfather decades earlier. "This farm will be a place where people come to learn about the past," Sadie continued, "but more importantly, it will be a place where they're challenged to think about their role in the ongoing story of human dignity and freedom." The ceremony concluded with the formal installation of the National Historic Landmark plaque, but for Jack, the real climax had been watching his daughter embrace her role as a guardian of family legacy and moral purpose. As the crowd began to disperse, Jack found himself alone with Sadie in the chamber where everything had started. The wooden box sat open on the stone shelf, its contents representing both the completion of one journey and the beginning of another. "Mom would have been so proud of you today," he said quietly. "She would have been proud of both of us," Sadie replied. "We figured out how to honor the past and build the future at the same time." Jack nodded, understanding that they had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They were no longer just a struggling family trying to survive. They were the stewards of a story that belonged to the world, custodians of a legacy that would outlive them both. The Northern Star Brigade had found its newest guardians, and they were ready for whatever challenges that responsibility might bring. The weeks following the designation ceremony brought a steady stream of visitors to the Mallory farm, but it was the arrival of an elderly man named Joseph Kowalski that provided the final piece of Jack's understanding of his grandfather's legacy. Joseph was 96 years old, bent with age, but with eyes that still sparkled with intelligence and determination. He had driven from Chicago with his grandson, carrying a worn leather briefcase that he clutched with protective care. "I was one of the boys your grandfather helped," he said simply, when Jack greeted him at the door. "I need to return something that's been in my family for 78 years. They sat in the kitchen, 3 generations of Kowalskis facing 3 generations of Mallorys, as Joseph carefully opened his briefcase. Inside was a collection of items that took Jack's breath away. Handmade identification papers bearing his grandfather's careful forgery work, a photograph of young Joseph with William Mallory standing in front of the barn, and a small key tied with faded ribbon. "I was 17, Joseph began, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "My family was Jewish, living in a small town in Poland when the war started. By 1943, I was the only one left alive, and I had escaped from a work camp near the German border." He lifted the photograph from the briefcase, studying it with eyes that had seen too much history. "I made it to England, then to Canada, and finally to the United States. Your grandfather didn't just help me escape, he helped me become American. These papers he made, they gave me a new identity, a new chance at life." Joseph's grandson, a man in his 60s named David, leaned forward. "Grandpa never talked about the war when we were growing up, but after the story about your farm appeared in the news, he decided it was time to share what he'd kept hidden all these years." The elderly man's hands shook slightly as he held up the key. "Your grandfather gave me this the night before I left the farm. He said it was for something he'd hidden that would help my children and grandchildren understand what freedom meant." Jack studied the key, recognizing its age and the careful craftsmanship of its construction. "Do you know what it opens?" "I think I do now," Joseph said. "After reading about all the hidden compartments and secret storage areas you've found, I believe your grandfather gave me the key to something he wanted me to protect until the time was right to return it." Sadie, who had been listening intently, suddenly straightened. "The bank safety deposit box, the one mentioned in Great-Grandpa's final letter. We never found the key." Jack's pulse quickened as the implications became clear. His grandfather had entrusted Joseph with the key to the safety deposit box that contained the final elements of the preservation trust. not just as a safeguard, but as a way of ensuring that a survivor of the network would be involved in revealing the complete story. The trip to the bank in town was conducted with the solemnity of a religious ceremony. Eleanor Patterson accompanied them, along with Dr. Hendricks and David Chen, all of them understanding that they were about to witness the final revelation of William Mallory's carefully orchestrated plan. The safety deposit box contained documents that completed the historical record of the Northern Star Brigade. But more importantly, it contained a trust fund that had been set aside specifically for survivors and descendants of those who had been helped by the network. The final document in the box was a letter addressed to Joseph Kowalski, dated 1945. My young friend, if you are reading this, it means that our story has finally been told and our work has been recognized. I'm entrusting you with this key, not just as a safeguard, but as a symbol of the continuing connection between those who help and those who are helped. The fund I have established is not just for preserving the physical site where our work took place, it is for continuing the work itself. Every generation will face its own refugees, its own displaced persons, its own people in need of help, crossing dangerous territory to reach safety. Use this fund to help them, as we helped you. Train others to recognize when ordinary people can become extraordinary by choosing compassion over comfort. Ensure that the Northern Star Brigade never truly ends, but adapts to meet the challenges of each new era. You were a boy when we met, but you are a man now, with children and grandchildren of your own. Teach them that being saved is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the responsibility to save others. As Joseph finished reading the letter aloud, Jack understood that the designation ceremony had been only the beginning. His grandfather had created not just a memorial to past heroism, but a foundation for future action. What happens now? Sadie asked. Joseph smiled, his aged features suddenly animated with purpose. Now we figure out how to be Northern Star Brigade for today's world. Your great-grandfather didn't save my life just so I could live it for myself. He saved it so I could use it to save others. Jack looked around at the group gathered in the small bank vault. Historians, family members, survivors, descendants, and realized they had become something unprecedented, a living memorial that could adapt and respond to contemporary challenges. While honoring the courage of previous generations, the key had opened more than a safety deposit box. It had opened a door to understanding that true historical preservation meant keeping the spirit of resistance and compassion alive, not just maintaining buildings and artifacts. The Northern Star Brigade was about to be reborn for the 21st century, and Jack Mallory finally understood his full role in that rebirth. 1 year later, Jack Mallory stood in the same spot where he had first fallen through the rotted floorboards of his barn, but everything around him had transformed beyond recognition. The underground chamber had been carefully restored and expanded into a proper museum space, with professional lighting that highlighted the carved symbols on the walls and display cases that held the artifacts of his grandfather's resistance work. But it was the portrait that dominated the space that moved Jack the most. Sadie had commissioned it as a surprise for the anniversary of the National Historic Landmark designation, a painting of William Mallory standing in the underground chamber, surrounded by the maps and radio equipment that had been the tools of his trade, but with his face turned upward toward the opening that led to the world above. "He looks like he's listening for something," visitors often commented, and Jack had come to understand that they were right. His grandfather's expression captured the essence of someone who was always alert for the next person who might need help, the next call to service that would require courage and compassion. The Mallory Farm Educational Center had become more than anyone had dared to hope. School groups arrived weekly for programs about civilian resistance and moral courage. Graduate students came to conduct research using the extensive archives they had assembled. Most importantly, the modern Northern Star Brigade program had helped coordinate assistance for over 200 refugee families in its first year of operation, using the endowment funds to provide temporary housing, legal assistance, and job training. Sadie had deferred college for a year to help establish the programs, but she would be starting at the University of Chicago in the fall with a full scholarship to study international relations and human rights advocacy. The shy, angry teenager who had discovered her great-grandfather's compass had become a confident young woman whose passion for justice inspired everyone who met her. "The tour group from the high school is here," she announced, stepping into the underground chamber where Jack was making final preparations for the day's activities. "Mrs. Patterson's old school?" Jack asked, straightening his tie. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, but he had learned that sharing his grandfather's story was part of his responsibility as guardian of the legacy. Some of her former students, actually. They're in their 60s now, but they wanted to hear about the history they never knew was happening in their own community. Jack smiled, thinking about Eleanor Patterson, who had become the unofficial historian of the project and spent her days cataloguing oral histories from elderly residents who remembered the war years. At 74, she had more energy for the work than people half her age. The tour went smoothly, as they always did now. Jack had developed a rhythm for telling the story that balanced historical facts with personal reflection, helping visitors understand both what had happened and why. It still mattered, but it was during the question and answer session that something unexpected occurred. An elderly woman in the back of the group raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Mallory, I have something that might interest you. My father mentioned your grandfather in some letters he wrote during the war, but I never understood what he meant until today." After the tour ended, the woman, who introduced herself as Ruth Steinberg, approached Jack with a manila envelope that looked as old as the documents in his grandfather's collection. "My father was a supply sergeant stationed in England during the war," she explained. "He was responsible for coordinating shipments of equipment and supplies to resistance networks in occupied territories. These letters mention sending radio parts and other technical equipment to W. Mallory in the Midwest sector." Jack opened the envelope with trembling hands, finding correspondence that provided official confirmation of his grandfather's role in the Northern Star Brigade from the military side. But more than that, the letters revealed the scope of coordination between official military operations and civilian resistance networks. "Your grandfather wasn't just running a local operation," Ruth continued. "He was a key coordinator between military intelligence and civilian resistance networks across the entire Midwest. The equipment you found in that chamber came directly from military supplies." That evening, Jack and Sadie sat in the kitchen, poring over Ruth's father's letters and adding them to the ever-growing collection of documents that told the story of their family's involvement in wartime resistance. The kitchen table, that had once been covered with unpaid bills, now served as a workspace for historical preservation and education planning. "I keep thinking about Great-Grandpa's letter," Sadie said, looking up from a letter that described the shipping of radio components to the Mallory farm. The one where he said that being saved is just the beginning of the responsibility to save others. Jack nodded, understanding what she was thinking. Joseph's work with the modern Northern Star Brigade has shown us that the principle still applies. Every family we help settle into their new life becomes part of the network that helps the next family. "It's not just about preserving history," Sadie continued. "It's about keeping the spirit of resistance alive, making sure people understand that they have the power to make a difference when they see injustice." Through the kitchen window, Jack could see the lights of the visitor center that had been built adjacent to the barn. Tomorrow would bring another group of students, another opportunity to share the story of ordinary people choosing to do extraordinary things when history demanded it of them. But tonight, sitting with his daughter in the kitchen where Lieutenant Morrison had been nursed back to health, where refugee families had been given new identities and new hope. Jack felt the peaceful satisfaction of knowing that his family's story was being told, and that its lessons were being lived. The foreclosure notice that had once threatened everything they held dear now resided in the museum, displayed as an example of how close they had come to losing their connection to this remarkable history. Visitors often remarked on the irony that the family's darkest financial hour had led to the discovery that would secure their future permanently. Sarah's photograph sat on the kitchen counter, smiling down on the work that Jack knew she would have embraced wholeheartedly. She had always believed that family stories were meant to be shared, and she would have been proud to see how sharing their story had become a way of serving others. As Jack prepared for bed, he walked through the house that now felt larger and more purposeful than it ever had before. Each room held memories, not just of his own family, but of all the families who had passed through seeking safety and hope. In the barn, the restored underground chamber waited for tomorrow's visitors, ready to tell its story of courage, compassion, and the power of ordinary people to change the world. And above it, the farm continued its daily work of feeding the present while preserving the past and preparing for the future. The Northern Star Brigade had been reborn, and its light would continue to guide those who needed help finding their way home.